So it's a great honor to be here on the territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit. What a week we have had in the human rights field. As an elder described one of the U.S. candidates for president, he said he is all hat and no cattle. Many of us, I think, were gasping the day after the U.S. election. But the best antidote to discrimination and intolerance is actually each one of you. And you have a lot of work to do in this country. As Danielle explained, our federal government, your federal government, is consciously racially discriminating against children and has done so since Confederation. The only antidote to that truly is each of you. And these are some of the children that the government doesn't think is worth the money. These are children from Norway House Cree Nation, the home of something called Jordan's Principle. And they're holding teddy bears because they're hoping that Jordan's Principle will ensure that every child, including them, will get equal access to government services on the same terms that all of you enjoy. This is in May of this year. This is our civil rights movement. That discrimination is our Confederate flag. And yet for too long in this country, caring Canadians did not know this inequality existed and often judged these children as if they got more, not less, than other Canadian kids. Social work has been a part of this story, and not in a favorable way. We have been more apt to raise the Confederate flag than to take it down. If I was to tell you that First Nations children are 12 times more likely to end up in foster care today, and overall Aboriginal children account for roughly 50% of all children in care, who here thinks the child welfare system is failing? I disagree with all of you. As my colleague, John Malloy, the historian, says, in order to make that assessment, you need to understand why it was developed in the first place. This is the earliest child welfare document in the record. It predates anything in non-Indigenous child welfare that I'm aware of. It's dated 1895. It's a warrant requisitioned by Duncan Campbell Scott, the senior official on a residential schools file. He is asking for a warrant for the removal of children from residential schools so that they may be placed, they may be removed for education, which we knew was not that, and also because they were not properly cared for. Not properly cared for, with some minor tweaking in the regulations, maps on perfectly to contemporary definitions of neglect, for which drives the overrepresentation of Indigenous children today. Now, what is the problem with not properly cared for, and what is the problem with neglect? The problem was and is that it codifies structural discrimination as a parental deficit. We use risk assessment tools that do not tease out what people can change on their own from what we have imposed on a people. And that consistency is a problem. There's another problem too, is that we assume where we place children is better from where they came from. An Aboriginal woman in Australia said, the day those social workers removed me, they promised me a better life and they didn't deliver. Why is it that we do structured decision-making tools on families and not on where we're gonna put the kids? I think that would stop a lot of removals. That family would be starting to look a lot like a better option if we were to do that. And I say that as someone who was on the front lines for 13 years. I'm not a utopian thinker. I know some of our kids need to be in child welfare care, but not at 12 times the rate. The day the tribunal decision came down, I actually got a copy a couple of days before everybody else. I was at a graduation party for a social work student. It was a wonderful graduation party at the luncheon. And that decision of 9 years came as a beep on my iPhone. And when it arrived, the whole room went silent. Time itself for me stood still. It took me a while to press the document because inside was the fate of 163,000 kids. At stake was the basic moral character of this country. And eventually I pushed it, and the first line is, "This decision is about children," underlined. And I had to get out of there. I had to leave right away. I just grabbed my things I left because I knew I had a promise to keep. You see, the day before Prime Minister Harper apologized for the wrongs done to Aboriginal people at the residential school, I was in Beechwood Cemetery. There, with a brightly colored bouquet of daisies that represented the joys of children, and I was here to see this man, who I consider to be one of the greatest honorary social workers of our time, and yet our profession knows nothing of him. His name is Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce. He was born in Mount Pleasant, Ontario, just outside of Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve Territory. He graduated from the University of Toronto when Canada was 9 years old, and he rose to the top of the medical profession. He wrote Canada's first health code. He's the reason why you can turn on a tap and get clean water. Most of you can anyway today. Immunizations, all of those things. He was president of the American Public Health Association, founder of the Canadian Public Health Association, and he also dabbled in a lot of letter writing. At the age of 51, as an expert in communicable diseases, he's hired by the Department of Indian Affairs to go out and check out the health of the kids in the residential schools. And what does he find? The kids are dying at a rate of 24% a year. If you track the kids over 3 years, it's 48%. And in File Hills Residential School, for which there was a complete record, 76% of the kids are dead by the time they're 16. The cost of medical science doing just what it knows how to do to save these children's lives was $10,000 to $15,000 back then. Not even a lot of money in those days. But the government refused to do it. Government said it cost too much money. So somehow, Dr. Bryce's report makes it on the front page of the Ottawa Citizen newspaper. No one knows for sure how it got there, but there is one leading suspect. He believed, you see, in the conversation of reconciliation, there's three players. There's the government, which sadly our Canadian government has consistently been a wrongdoer towards First Nations kids. There's been the whistleblower, like Dr. Bryce. And then there have been the people of the period, like us. And in many ways, colonization perpetuates because we, the people of the period, allow it to happen. See, governments don't create change, they respond to change. Now, Dr. Bryce knew that, and that's why this report appears on the front page of the Ottawa Citizen, Evening Citizen, as it's called then. He used to pick it up for 1 cent, and it was echoed in newspapers all across the country. He screamed into silence, he hoped that caring Canadians, people of the period just like you, would rise up and you would demand the government did better. He did scream out, but he was met only with silence. But that did not stop him. Inside of the department, he kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and for that, many people describe him as being ignored, but that is an improper characterization. He was not ignored. They persecuted him. They cut his research funding. They stopped him from presenting his findings at conferences. They denied him promotions for which he was eminently qualified. They tried to discredit him. But thankfully, by this time, he's already so well established that they really couldn't do very much. But they made his life miserable. And in 1922, he just gets pushed out of the public service, but even then he was not done. He believed that people of the period like you would do the right thing, so he made a last attempt. He published a pamphlet called A National Crime. And today, as you watch the Remembrance Day ceremonies, you're going to see the post office and this false front, James Hope and Son. That's where Bryce would have walked in 1922 with this manuscript, detailing all of Canada's malfeasance. Now, you might wonder if Bryce was alone. He wasn't. See, this is one of the false narratives of the residential school story. There were always people who knew what they were doing was wrong. The Canada always knew what it was doing was wrong. And one of the people who read Dr. Bryce's report is the founder of Blake's law firm, Samuel Hume Blake, who in 1908, after reading the front page of the Citizen, says that in that Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. This pamphlet was produced and printed and given to every member of Parliament, all members of the clergy, and prominent business people. It was featured on Saturday Night Magazine, which was published in Canada up until just a few years ago. And we, the people of the period, did not respond. So Bryce dies in 1932 to be erased from the Canadian story. But he was not the only whistleblower. This is a letter from a little boy in residential schools. His name is Edward B., and it's written in the Christmas season of 1923, a year after Bryce's report. And as you can see, it's written, "Dear Parent," and we don't know if it ever got to his parents. But he is talking about how hungry he and the other boys are in the schools. So hungry they're eating cats and they're eating wheat. And as a little boy who's being treated cruelly by his teacher, the only thing he can think about is, I'm not going to cry anymore. I can't cry. I'm not crying anymore. And I am going to strike her the next time she's mean. While we don't know if this letter ever reached his parents, we do know it did reach someone very important. It was read by no other than Duncan Campbell Scott himself, who in reply said 99% of the kids in the residential schools are too fat anyway. I don't know how many people have seen pictures of kids in residential schools, but that's not a characterization I would have used. At the time when he received this letter, he is serving as president of the Royal Society of Canada. He is being acknowledged for his contributions as a Confederate poet, but also as a loyal public servant. Scott would go on to receive 2 honorary doctorates, one from Queen's University, the other from the University of Toronto. And upon his death in 1947, he's listed as one of Canada's eminent Canadians. The Government of Canada holds a large reception for this loyal public servant. And he is well remembered in the history books and in the English literature books and Canadian literature books of high schools across the country. It would be many, many years before his legacy would be properly, fully acknowledged in this country. And what about this not properly cared for provision? Well, I want to talk about the power of colonialism in our profession. This is a letter written by a social worker. And as you can see, it's written to parents that get the privilege of having their kids home from residential schools. The privilege of having your own kid home from residential schools. I have another letter written by a social worker here from Ontario, and it talks about, well, it acknowledges on first blush, this is written in the 70s, that some of the children can go home from residential schools, and I'm sure they'll be okay with their families. But there's some kids who are really concerned about, so we should do risk assessments on those families. He doesn't call it risk assessments back then, but that's basically what it meant. That all sounds kosher until you realize that that letter is written by a social worker working at St. Anne's Residential School. That's the one with the electric chair, where they electrified the children for amusement and for discipline. Why is it that we don't look at the harms that we're perpetrating? You know, that's one of the problems with our profession, is that we don't have a Hippocratic oath. And many of the social workers engaged in residential schools, and there were thousands of them, often believed they were doing the right thing. But it's not enough to believe you're doing the right thing. In fact, it can be dangerous if you rely on that. By 1967, over 80% of the kids are placed in residential schools under the not properly cared for provision by social workers. But this guy, George Caldwell, does a study for Indian Affairs back in 1967, calling on the need to provide culturally based services in the families versus putting these kids in residential schools. So we're starting to see a pattern unfold here, where the Government of Canada knows about the harms for First Nations kids, it has the remedies to fix it, and it chooses not to fix it, time and time again. This isn't a problem without solutions. Echoing that same year, which is, anybody know why 1967 is an important year? Confederation, right? 100 years. This is a report for education, right? This is a guy named Sims writing about First Nations education, where the pace is so glacial in change. And he wonders what year or what century real progress will be made to the achievement of First Nations kids in education, because they were significantly underfunded then. And I want you to think about that, right? You have kids who carry a backpack of being unequal child welfare services, unequal education services. 1 in 6 First Nations kids does not even have clean water to drink. What happens to kids when they're in that environment is they start to codify that racial discrimination as a personal deficit. They start to feel like they're not worth the money. So to me, it's not surprising at all that we see the tragic youth suicide rates in First Nations communities across this country. This is the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, also filed as an exhibit at the Tribunal. 1996, I was a social worker for a decade then, and I thought, woohoo, the day has come when they're going to solve this problem. Recommending that the agencies are provided with equitable and culturally based support so they can implement reforms. Had that been implemented, we would have never brought the case in the first instance. It wasn't. We did 2 reports with the government documenting the shortfalls. They agreed back in 2000, First Nations kids get 78 cents on the dollar for child welfare services, even though their needs are higher. In 2005, it was more like 70 cents on the dollar compared to non-Aboriginal kids. The government sends in letters saying, we recognize the reports, we agree with the findings, and then they do nothing about it, or very little about it. And that's what resulted in us bringing this case. I still remember getting the leaflet from the Canadian Human Rights Commission. I can't remember, I don't even think I would have printed it off of the web back then, right? Think about it, 2005. And the reason I found it so compelling is it's supposed to be like social workers like me can somehow navigate this system, a citizen-friendly approach. I thought, perfect, this is exactly what I need. Pressed it off. It is a complete lie that it's citizen-friendly when you're taking on a respondent like Canada. But I'm glad we did it anyway. In some ways, the naivete was the good thing to do. We filed the case against the Canadian government.